I'm gonna kick things off, and it looks like we've got a pretty good sized crowd here. So, again, I'm Lee. I'm the managing editor for IM 1776. I will be hosting tonight for tonight's discussion. I did want to recognize that we have Eric Prince here. Eric Prince is a businessman, an investor, an author, and also a veteran of the special operations community, and most notably the founder of Blackwater. We were really fortunate to have Eric join us last year for an event in Nashville in which he gave a great speech and was able to share some of his wisdom with us. He's also contributed to several projects that we've had. We had an interview that Ben Braddock led back in 2023 with Eric. And then later, Eric also wrote a piece for us called Too Big to Win. And I'll be sure to share some of these links down in the comments below for those of you who may not have read those. But Eric has definitely an interesting perspective. And I think as the world is changing, as we have a new change in administration as well, it's a really good opportunity for us to kind of talk a little bit about the future and about American grand strategy. I think just to kind of start us off with that, that's the background. Eric, I'd really like to get your perspective on that, this moment we live in with Donald Trump kind of embodying this change. What do you think?
Yes, I think what we're seeing is a return to realpolitik, reality-based politics, instead of ideology, pie in the sky hope that has unfortunately been the practice for really since after World War II. The neocon paradigm that originally started as a Trotskyite, true internationalist way of thinking that infected even some parts of Republican and Democrat, call it big Washington foreign policy thinking, has always led with a kind of an all government all the time with unlimited resources to throw at something. And that if we just, it became the way of Washington that if we just spend more money and throw more effort and more people at it, eventually we're gonna win. And I think as we saw in Afghanistan or Iraq, that fire hose of cash that the US sprayed at seemingly every problem and challenge instead fertilized weeds instead of growing grass or growing something of lasting value. And so, you know, President Trump has been right to readdress that because we don't have infinite resources. It's that attitude of all government all the time is why we're 35 trillion in debt. And so to pare back and to pause and to actually reevaluate what's important, what's unimportant, is essential. And it was this. It was essential that some adult leadership actually take over and reevaluate the many wrong paths that we've gone down. Um, the USAID money of 40-ish, $50 billion that was sprayed all over the world in many ways crowded out the private sector from providing solutions both for aid, for economic development, and even for more effective security assistance. And of course, some of the security assistance also comes from the Pentagon, and it's led to this setup of 400 some bases splattered all over the planet, and less credibility because our forces. I mean, I should think about how few insurgencies, for example, we've extinguished um, since World War II, and we don't have a great track record of that. We have a military and a AID parallel that was very much focused on perpetuating the budget and almost perpetuating the problem, and no one was paid to solve it. A private sector organization that was tasked with stability or in whatever it might be, developing a resource in a certain area, looks to minimize the conflict, end it as soon as possible because it's really expensive. And so finding ways to cauterize the bleeding instead of perpetuate it um, is a real necessity. And so I even so again a return to actual realpolitik, uh, reality-based decision making instead of what the swamp would continue to rebound. Even the Trump administration is being greeted by the realities because they wanted to do significant deportation, rightly, of the many, many, many um, tens of millions of illegal migrants, many of them hard criminal migrants. And they started using C-17s to do that, but at what, 35 to $50,000 an hour. They soon realize it's can be hundreds of thousands of dollars per illegal to actually deport them that way. And so they've halted C-17s, and they're going to have to turn to the private sector as a way to clean up, to deport and to do the process that they've embarked on.
So, Eric, along that line, I mean, you brought up USAID, for example. When Trump was considering cutting it, there was talk of that, and then there started to be mass layoffs, a big trimming of that organization, and then that was followed by other agencies through Doge. There was a lot of talk from those who are kind of the permanent bureaucracy class in Washington about how this would diminish U.S. influence when the United States needed it most. Kind of referring back to this old Cold War paradigm in which, wielding influence, soft power was a strategy for defeating the Soviet Union. It seems like a lot of that thinking is still replicated there today with USAID and others. So, what's your take on that when it comes to soft power and its uses in the hands of the government? I know that the Trump administration is trying to contain China, for example. What is the appropriate use of soft power? What are your thoughts on that? Do you think that there's a better way to do it?
The business of America is business, and the best, most effective, most lasting US presence and influence in certain countries, in any country really, is American business presence because of the commerce that they do, the employment they provide, a window of what a well run organization, American organization, looks and feels like. And it is infinitely better than the fortress mentality that our embassies have become, where they're not really focused on trade and promoting American business, but rather, I mean, in the last few years, even decades, uh, American diplomacy has become one of promoting crazy woke ideology, completely divorced from the reality of whatever societies they're in, and how ridiculous is even the stuff they were pushing in Africa, while the average African family of four lives with less than 4 hours of a 100-watt light bulb per day. Uh, so truly insane. It's one of the reasons the Chinese have shown significantly more success at presence in Africa because they're worried. They're there for the resources to extract them, and they at least provide to the host governments some promise of roads, bridges, water, power, sewage infrastructure that didn't exist before, and infinitely better than how to cut off your genitalia classes that the State Department was actually been paying for.
So, in that line, when we're talking about pursuing some of these strategic interests in different parts of the world, so for example, the Trump administration has talked a lot about Greenland, the Arctic, some of these other locations that have, there's strategic minerals and resources there. The Arctic, for example, also gives the United States access to key waterways to other parts of the world. Uh, what would you say about what do you think in this world to come as things are changing? What are some of these strategic resources or maybe locations that you think the Trump administration should be focusing on, or if they are focusing on, should continue to focus on?
Well, hydrocarbons will continue to be a huge part of our global energy supply for decades to come. Even if there is a steady um, transition towards renewable energy or nuclear power, et cetera, hydrocarbons are still going to power a lot. The minerals required to do a tech transformation or to build the data centers and AI computing power all comes from mining in often remote, weird, and difficult places. And so the U.S. definitely has an interest in securing those commercially and providing enough security so that those American commercial interests and their offtake ability have the reliability of supply with no drama back to processing in the United States. Now, the United States has gotten so far behind in processing so many of those strategic minerals, like 90 to 95% of the processing of those minerals, of the strategic minerals, rare earths, is done in China. Even the one real effective rare earth mine that we have in the United States called Mountain Pass, California, all its offtake it gets shipped off to China for processing. So the U.S. has to catch up in actually building processing. Now, and the downside of that is a lot of that processing of those minerals is quite a dirty process. And so I recommend that's where government can actually or should be involved and create some effectively free zones or dirty process friendly areas. And I'm suggesting something like Dugway Proving Ground in Utah, which is where the U.S. used to do chemical warfare testing. So you're never going to build condos there, but let that be the spot where U.S. domestic mines or friendly controlled mines from around the world can send their minerals to process so that we are not completely and utterly beholden to China for the rare earths that are required for uh, sensors in the front end of a air-to-air or air-to-ground missile, or unique minerals used for chips and for computing capability. That's we're completely behind the power curve there and should be fixed quickly. On the mineral supply side, you have places like the DRC, Democratic Republic of Congo, where 70% of the world's cobalt comes from, and a significant amount of copper, and they have been invaded by their neighbor, by Rwanda, and now Rwanda and Uganda have entered into a military alliance, um, and they've invaded the east of DRC. Rwanda is basically trying to hack off about 10 times the size of Rwanda from the DRC, and they're doing exactly what the Soviet Union and the Nazis did to Poland in 1939 with the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. So it'll be interesting to see how the Trump administration handles that and diplomatically, hopefully, super pressures the Rwandans to back off, or are there commercial solutions available to help DRC regain its territorial sovereignty? Because I think it's a really bad look for Africa if Rwanda, as a now aggressor, right? They had a terrible problem with the genocide 30 years ago, but now the victim has very much become the aggressor to the point of using Chinese surface to air missiles, Turkish drones with precision weapons, Israeli spike missiles, anti-tank weapons, Polish jammers, um, and a lot of manpads. So they're using the $600 million a month that they're stealing in gold from Eastern DRC, from North and South Kivu, exporting it, taking that money and using it to double down and to hack off more and more. There's actually about 4,000 South African peacekeepers, now hostages or prisoners of war, that were taken in this last Rwandan offensive. So as places like that of high value in the ground become more contested, the U.S. has to figure out how they're going to stabilize those, how they're going to defend American interests. Can you still hear me?
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay. How they're going to defend really, really key mineral supplies, and because the opponents are also looking at the best ways to do it. You know, the Wagner Group largely controls, or the successor to the Wagner Group, controls the entire Central African Republic country just to the north of it, and takes a couple $1 billion a year in gold and other minerals out, which in many ways funds Russia's efforts in Ukraine. So the old contests of countries' interests will play out in distant shores in unusual ways, and the U.S. has to figure out how to be fast, innovative, adaptive, or they're going to continue to get rolled.
So that leads me to this question of Africa, for example. So I'm an old Africa hand deployed there. I felt like we were far behind the curve, behind other countries like even Russia, China, Turkey. In these places like Africa, which has been really the whole continent has been neglected by much of the world. There's just a lack of capital that you see in places like Western Europe and the United States. But Africa has an immense amount of resources, but it has also has a lot of instability. Do you see then Africa playing a larger role with some of these backwaters than they have in the past? I mean, if I look at the United States, they've really kind of used the State Department and the diplomatic arm to kind of own the continent, to be able to make decisions that don't often seem to have much of a strategic value. It's more of like old school diplomacy from the Cold War. I mean, it sounds like you're saying that it looks like this is all set to change. So, what kind of role will Africa play for a country like the United States?
Whether it's Africa, Latin America, I mean, the amount of mineral value and assets and farming and things of real value in South America are also enormous. But again, the US has been asleep at the switch. Our State Department has been horribly run over the last few decades, and it needs a massive Doge house cleaning to refocus it on promoting America, American interest, American business, and not pushing the kind of bizarre social engineering that they have been doing these past decades. Um, what past is prologue, and what you've seen in the past in terms of companies or countries contesting over certain minerals. I mean, the French and British companies pretty much went to war in India over trade routes. The same in the Indonesia, South Asian island chains between the Dutch and the British, again for trade. So a lot of those things you'll see contesting and operations under the threshold of war, certainly, but no less very relevant in how countries can protect the investments of long-term endeavors.
Okay. Well, yeah, and I think that this all lends itself to when we talk about grand strategy and you kind of look at the hedgehog versus the fox, and how a nation is supposed to navigate these kinds of places. Has to be nimble, it has to be able to move effectively and quickly and change to adapting circumstances. I think that this lends itself to what we've been discussing about Donald Trump's approach to foreign policy, which seems to be much more transactional, a lot more nimble, can change rather than holding to these old alliances and relationships and allowing kind of the bureaucracy to run the show. In that vein, I want to be sensitive to time, so I do want to bring Ben Braddock in to kind of do a little bit more of a deep dive into Latin America. So Ben, I'm going to hand things over to you for a moment.
Okay, and let me just make one comment. A quote from George Washington is that we do not have eternal friends or eternal enemies. I think it's very wise for countries to always be reminded of that.
No friends, just interests. Good to talk to you
Yeah.
again, Eric. Wanted to get your take on some of the vision moving forward for Latin America. We've just come out of a period of about 4 years where uh, it seems like Latin America either got short shrift by the foreign policy establishment, or when they weren't ignoring what was going on in Latin America, it seemed that they were actively working to undermine U.S. interests. One of the big things being, well, this goes back to 2019 when the Puebla group met, and they were really just a reconstituted old form of Sao Paulo that was set up by Castro and Lula to create a alternative to the USSR in Latin America, or at least a funding mechanism that could replace Soviet aid. And they met, and in 2019 they formulated a series of strategies. A lot of it was retreads, things they had used before, but they added some new elements to it with the use of social media and other technologies. And after that, we saw a steady succession of countries falling to left wing socialist governments across the region. Uh, Colombia elected a leftist for the first time in their history. Chile,
Not just a
mhm,
leftist. Petro used to be in the M19, the communist, effectively the
right,
Communist Party of Colombia. He's a bad guy,
actual
and they
guerrilla.
used to
Yeah,
call him. They used to call him the shitter, um, because he used to take. I mean, he used to defecate on hostages in the whole
yeah,
held in pits out in the
yes,
jungle. This is a bad
yeah.
guy.
Yeah, and his vice president, Francia Marquez, she was a creation of USAID. Her first job out of university was working for USAID, and they promoted her on their social media accounts and such. And she actually went on a tour of Africa after her election, where she was. It was said she was delivering the message in a lot of countries, different groups within those countries, that hey, Colombia is going to be open for migrants. You guys can fly into El Dorado Airport in Bogota, start your journey northward. That trip was arranged and paid for by Soros, and that's not a theory. She thanks them in a tweet that's still up on her account. Thank you guys for paying for this trip and putting it together. But seriously, radical administration there in Colombia, and Colombia has always been a really key U.S. partner in the region, going back to the '80s and before. And by 2022, it seemed like El Salvador and maybe Peru were the only countries that had a right wing government. And in the case of Peru, not even right wing, just slightly center right. But there's this big pink tide that engulfed Latin America, and it seems like there's been some pushback on that. I think Bukele's successes have been a great model for the region. They've shown people that you don't have to, as the president of Colombia would say, we build universities, and 30 years later, the crime rate will finally come down. This is their whole root cause approach that doesn't really get at anything. It's just a way to funnel money. Um, but even now, even though things have changed a bit, I mean, you have Malay in Argentina. He's done a really good job of getting a hold of the fiscal situation, but it's still, very much an uphill battle. And the big linchpin falling was Brazil, because we had Brazil, I think, ready to, I think Bolsonaro would have left BRICS in a heartbeat if he had a good deal with the US coming. But then, Biden gets in, and it was over a year that there were no high level contacts between Bolsonaro and anyone in the US government. He couldn't even get a call with the Secretary of State. And then when they finally did engage, and they sent uh, the Secretary of Defense, Director of the CIA, and the National Security Advisor to Brazil to meet their counterparts in the lead up to the election in 2022, they delivered the message from the Biden administration, which was that if the military exercised its constitutionally protected responsibilities to ensure free and fair elections, that any involvement in the military would be grounds for U.S. sanctions to be placed on Brazil. So, not only did we not, do anything to uh, pull in what I would regard as the next other most important country in the Western Hemisphere, we then actively undermine that situation and have pushed Brazil into the further into the BRICS axis, and where it's also being used to prop up leftist governments around the region. Venezuela, Colombia, obviously, and Cuba, but a lot of this, I think a lot of people look at the Chinese interest in Latin America, and that's kind of their focus is on finding ways to box out China. But Cuba is still very much involved, and the Cuban intelligence services are quite good. They've been very involved in helping coordinate these color revolution style leftist takeovers across Latin America. So I know you've been actively involved in Venezuela, and wanted to get your take on the situation there, and then just on the region at large.
So you're right about the pervasive negative influence. Cuba, after um, the Cold War ended, after the Soviet Union collapsed, went looking for a new sponsor, a new host to attach itself to, and they did so to Venezuela. So Venezuelan money with paired with the Cuban intelligence service and kind of a next generation, Patrice Lumumba University, like the Soviets ran in Moscow, worked to develop more socialist, Marxist friendly governments across Latin America. And you spoke to that kind of pink red tide flooding parts of the Western Hem. Um, I was exceedingly glad to see the Trump administration pull the oil sanction licenses from Chevron, from Sargent Oil, and a couple other American entities, literally enabling Maduro to make more and more money to oppress the country and to further steal that election. We we raised some money for a program called Yucasi Venezuela, and that money is in process of building some capability, at least some demo capability. We didn't raise enough to tip the government over, but definitely enough to push back on and to take away some of the inevitability of the Maduro regime. It's been heartening to see Maria Corina Machado be fierce and relentless in her demanding freedom there. I don't see the Trump administration sending troops, but perhaps they do conduct some covert action, or other neighbors can, to actually push the Maduro regime out, because they are gangsters. They're behaving like gangsters, and they just recently stepped in it again, as recently this week, when Venezuelan Navy gunboats went out and threatened Exxon floating petroleum storage, unload and storage facility boats off the coast of Guyana. So Maduro, and his clique, is a bad organization, and they need to be driven from the illegal rule that they have. It's been great to see. You're right. People like Milei bring fiscal sanity and cut down the bloated waste in Argentina, and I hope other Latin leaders take note and learn that it is possible, because Mexico is certainly at risk of becoming more and more subject to narco traffickers as the real power behind the presidency there. So it's going to be interesting, and I hope with a Secretary of State of Cuban heritage that's going to pay a lot more attention to Latin America and to fix our issues. But the more American business gets involved to counter the malign, the malign influence of the leftist USAID, and the organized left, it will be better and better, because ultimately it's a competition of governance. I'm a huge fan of Hernando de Soto and what he has done and helped countries to get past the same kind of failing bureaucratized states where people don't have property rights, rule of law, banking, etc. And so the more actual capitalism is promoted and enabled in these countries, it tends towards wealth creation and less insanity of more and more government.
Eric, I just wanted to ask. I know you're short on time, so the last questions I'll kind of funnel those into this question is just how do you see Ukraine playing out? What do you see as the alignment between Russia and China now? One of those bad consequences of the Biden administration. How do you see the changing face of war that we're seeing in Ukraine? Like, how do you perceive the aftermath of this event?
It is in the United States' immediate, midterm, and long-term interest to have Russia uh, resume normal relations with Europe and the United States, and to push and to help them out of a unhealthy, dangerous to us, subservient relationship to China. Because for 100 years, it was our policy to keep German industry from combining with Russian resources. And now all we've done is push Russian resources into the hands of the Chinese Communist Party. That is a bad, bad combination for us in America. So I hope that the lines in Ukraine end up being frozen, because there's a 0% chance that the Ukrainians are going to retake all their land, and let it be solved with a competition of governance and trade. and not with arms. An imperfect peace is better than whatever daily combat and slaughter has been, hammering that place now for 3 years. Um, and so I hope that Trump team can negotiate and create enough interest on both sides. I don't know. Well, look, Ukraine actually has to have an election because the Russians are not going to seriously negotiate with Zelensky because they don't view him, because constitutionally he's not the legitimate ruler of Ukraine anymore, and so unable to bind the country in any kind of peace agreement. So I think they're going to drive towards having elections in May, and I would imagine a peace candidate will be elected. So that's how this gets solved.
All right. Well, Eric, I want to be sensitive to your time, so I want to thank you for joining us tonight for today's conversation. It's really been a privilege to be able to have you join us, and we hope that we can stay in touch in the future, moving forward. For those of you who have not read Eric's work over at IM 1776, we'll drop 2 of his articles, one an interview, the other that he wrote called "Too Big to Win." We'll drop those down in the comments for you to read. But Eric, thank you so much for joining us tonight, and we hope you have a great rest of your week.
You too. Thank you all.
All right. Thank you.